Part 1. The Ghost at the Banquet. The day my family's judgment was silenced by a stranger's bow. They didn't clap when I launched my company. They didn't visit when I got my first international keynote. But on the day of my sister's wedding, a stranger's bow silenced every whisper that had haunted me my whole life. I walked into the ballroom alone. Not because I had no one to bring, but because I wanted to. I needed to. I needed to remember what it felt like to enter a space without armor, without performance, to feel the weight of being unshielded and still decide I was enough. The chandeliers shimmered like they were mocking me. Every head turned, but not with warmth or curiosity. Their glances were sharp, evaluative, a silent jury I hadn't summoned. They saw the ringless hand, the sleek black dress, the absence of a +1. And worse, the presence of a woman they didn't understand, past 30, unmarried, successful in a way they couldn't measure with pearls and pedigree. One woman whispered, just loud enough to pierce me, "Poor thing, still can't find anyone." They didn't say my name, and neither did my sister. Vanessa was radiant, all teeth, all curated grace. She stood beside her third husband as though they were a glossy spread from a bridal magazine, flawless, retouched, and entirely unreal. She didn't even look at me, just floated past me in her gown as if I were a placeholder in a chair. I stood there feeling like a punctuation mark in someone else's story. Not a daughter, not a sister, just an oddity. And yet I stayed. I don't know why. Pride, defiance, or maybe something deeper. Maybe the part of me that had waited my whole life for someone, anyone, to truly see me, hoped today might crack that silence. Instead, what cracked was the air itself. A chair scraped at the front table. I barely noticed at first, until I saw who stood. Edward Sinclair, Logan's uncle. The man whose name appeared in global headlines like punctuation, CEO, deal maker, power broker. He was everything this room revered. And he was looking at me. Then he bowed. A full, deliberate, quiet bow. In a room where my own mother once told me not to wear anything too loud, Edward Sinclair bowed to me like I was the only thing that mattered. Gasps echoed. Forks paused midair. And I felt something inside me tear, then snap free. He walked over, not hurried, not hesitant, and then he said my name. Not Vanessa's sister, not the one who's always working, not the one who couldn't land a husband. Juliet Vaughn. He said it like it meant something. He thanked me, by name, for a tech model I'd presented years ago at Zurich, one that changed the trajectory of his conglomerate. He referenced details that weren't public, details no one in that ballroom could understand. But he had. He did. And for the first time, I realized it had never been that I wasn't enough. It had always been that they had no language for women like me. When he offered me a club soda and asked to walk with me, I said yes. Not because I needed the attention, but because I had earned the air I was breathing. Because maybe, just maybe, someone finally saw the architecture beneath the quiet. He spoke of my work, of the night I stayed up in a rented office on the verge of losing funding, of the things I had built with nothing but intellect and persistence. He saw what I had spent years hoping my family would. And yet, that recognition didn't feel like triumph. It felt like justice. The kind that doesn't need applause. Just acknowledgment. Part 2, the architect they never acknowledged. I was the family disappointment. Until a titan of industry bowed to me. I built systems while my sister built an image. But only one of us got the applause. Until that night. We stepped out onto the stone terrace. The air was cold, but it was the kind that wakes you up. Like clarity finally cutting through the fog. Edward didn't rush. He walked like a man used to being listened to. And when he spoke, it wasn't small talk. It was precision. I meant every word, he said. I recognized you the moment you walked in. I didn't respond. Not immediately. Because part of me was still back in that ballroom, watching my family shrink in their seats. Watching Vanessa grit her teeth through a frozen smile. Watching my mother pretend pride like she'd rehearsed it in a mirror but couldn't quite make it land. Edward continued. They don't see you, Juliet. But people like me, we know exactly who you are. And in that moment, I didn't feel vindicated. I felt grief. Grief for every year I had sat at Thanksgiving while Vanessa's dating life was dissected like state news, while my company's milestones went unmentioned. Grief for every time I told myself it didn't matter, that being seen by the world was enough if my parents couldn't clap for me. Grief for the 10-year-old who rewired a kitchen timer and didn't get a hug, just a scolding for making a mess. You changed the course of my company's direction, he said. You're the kind of mind I want on something new. Something that actually matters. It should have felt like triumph. But all I could think about was how long I had waited to hear words like that from my own father, and how they'd never come. I didn't answer right away, not out of hesitation, but because I was finally seeing the truth without flinching. I didn't need their validation anymore, not Edward's, not my family's, not even Vanessa's. I had already proved everything I needed to prove, by showing up, by staying silent when I could have burned the room down, by standing in my own skin without asking anyone to clap for it. We went back inside, and the temperature in that room had shifted. People stood. Not many, but some. Enough. The looks had changed. Curiosity had replaced dismissal. Some wore guilt, others awe. Vanessa's mother-in-law looked like someone had told her facelift had failed. Logan? He looked like a man watching his own spotlight flicker. But none of that mattered, because when Edward returned to his seat beside me and toasted to me, not out of charity, but respect, I didn't glow. I didn't beam, I just sat, hand steady, spine straight, and I let it land. Later that night, when the music dulled and the crowd thinned, my mother approached me. Not like a woman proud of her daughter. Like someone stepping out onto ice and praying it wouldn't crack. You looked beautiful tonight, she said. Her voice was softer than I remembered. Almost fragile. Thank you, I replied. We didn't know. About Zurich? About Edward? I know, I said. She reached for my hand. We're proud of you, Juliet. I didn't let the words comfort me. Not because they were too late, but because they were only being spoken now, after a stranger had paved the way. Why now? I asked. She blinked. Excuse me? Why are you proud now, Mom? Because someone powerful said I mattered? Or because you finally believe I do? She didn't answer, just squeezed my hand like silence could fix what silence had broken. I let her hold it. Then I let go. I left the ballroom before the party was over, alone. Again. But this time, I didn't feel like the forgotten one. I felt like the one who left before the music turned into noise. On the sidewalk outside, someone passed me, a junior exec I vaguely remembered from an acquisition. I didn't know you were that Juliet Vaughn, he stammered. I looked him dead in the eyes and said, You still don't. That was the difference now. They didn't define me anymore. And the woman they had tried to make invisible? She had become unignorable. Part 3, the day I stopped asking for applause. I didn't ruin my sister's wedding. The truth, they told me not to wear anything too loud. I wore silence like armor. And somehow that was still too much. There's a moment, years ago, I keep returning to. I was 15. I'd just built a prototype for an adaptive AI circuit as a science fair project. My teacher called it college-level work. She asked to submit it to a statewide competition on my behalf. I ran home, breathless with excitement. Vanessa was in the living room trying on dresses for homecoming. Our mother was clapping, fussing over the hemline. When I told them about the invitation, Mom smiled briefly, then glanced at Vanessa. That's nice, sweetie. Don't forget your sister's fittings are at 4. Can you be ready to drive her? And that was it. My win was a side note. Her dress was the headline. From that day forward, I stopped expecting their excitement. I carried my victories like secrets, trophies behind closed doors, never placed on mantles. So when Vanessa came up to me at the wedding, voice brittle and eyes too bright, I was already bracing. "What was that about?" she hissed. Her polite mask cracked with the effort of pretending nothing had shifted. "That," I said quietly, "was someone recognizing what you never did." Her face tightened. "You couldn't let me have one day?" I almost laughed. "One day? Vanessa, you've had a lifetime." It landed. I saw it. The flicker behind her eyes, the first flash of uncertainty in a woman who was always so sure she was the center. She turned away before I could say anything else. Too quickly. Too tense. Her bouquet shook in her grip like it knew it was part of a performance unraveling. The rest of the reception blurred. Toasts, laughter, lights. But I wasn't listening anymore, because I'd already heard the only thing that mattered. My own voice, steady, unflinching, unafraid. I remembered the nights I'd slept in my car after pitching to investors, the 3 a.m. emails, the partnerships dissolved in failure, the grit it took to survive without safety nets. And I realized, that story? That life? It was mine, not curated, not staged, not dressed in lace and denial. It was forged. And no one, not my family, not the wedding guests, not even the woman I shared childhood with, could take that from me. After the reception, as the music swelled into its final act, my father approached me. He hadn't said a word all night. He stood awkwardly, hands clasped, eyes darting like he was searching for the right script and finding only silence. "Your mother told me about the tech thing," he said. "The Zurich thing?" I nodded. "That's impressive." I waited. For warmth, for follow-up, for anything. But it never came. Just that one word. Impressive. Spoken like a stranger offering a handshake instead of a hug. That's when I knew. He wasn't capable of seeing me. Not really. He was trying, but not because he understood. Because he felt he was supposed to. It wasn't malice, it was absence. And that can hurt just as deeply. I didn't cry, not then. Not even after they left, all tulle and laughter and champagne clinks. But when I got in my car, turned the engine, and sat there beneath the towering venue windows, I felt something loosen. A knot I had carried in my chest for years. It wasn't grief, it wasn't triumph, it was relief, because I finally knew that I wasn't broken. They were just blind, and I was done performing for an audience that refused to lift their eyes. Part 4, the freedom in not being chosen. They left me out, so I built a life without them. They called me cold, ambitious, too much. But the truth is, I stopped asking to be chosen. I chose myself. When I was young, I thought love was earned. That if I did everything right, kept my voice small, my grades perfect, my passions quiet, someone would notice. That one day, my mother would say, "I'm proud of you," without flinching. That my father would ask me about my work and not about my ring finger. That my sister would call, just to hear my voice, not out of obligation. But that day never came. Instead, I became a master at shrinking, at editing myself, at presenting just enough to be tolerated, but never too much to make them uncomfortable. It wasn't until that wedding that I realized how much I'd swallowed. Every backhanded compliment, every "don't wear that" and "don't bring up work" and "let Vanessa have her moment." Every dismissal dressed up as advice. I didn't cry when Edward made that toast. I didn't cry when my mother reached for my hand. But I cried in the parking lot. Not because they had failed me, but because I had spent so long trying not to fail them. That was the rage, not at them, at me. At the girl who begged to be seen by people who only looked at mirrors. 2 days after the wedding, Edward Sinclair called. I I hadn't expected him to follow up. I thought maybe his words had been a generous moment, a correction as he called it. Nothing more, but it wasn't. He wanted to meet. Not in a boardroom, not at a dinner. He invited me to his home. Simple, private, human. I want your voice at the table, he said. Not as a guest, as a partner. And in that moment, I knew something had shifted, not just in him, but in me. I wasn't surprised. I wasn't starstruck. I was ready. Vanessa called that same night. Are we just done? She asked. There was no anger in her voice, just fatigue, like someone who had finally realized they didn't understand the rules of the game they thought they'd been winning. We don't have to be done, I said, but we can't go back. Why not? Because going back would mean swallowing myself again. Because I can't be the shadow to your spotlight anymore. Because I don't want to pretend that I'm not hurt by how easy it was for you to forget me. She went quiet. Then, I didn't know you needed that much. I laughed. Sad. I didn't need that much, Vanessa. I just needed something. After the call, I sat at my kitchen table and deleted an old document on my laptop. A folder titled Family Ideas. Invitations I never sent, speeches I never gave, trips I hoped we'd take someday. It was my blueprint for belonging. I watched the files disappear and felt lighter. Because I finally understood. I wasn't building a life they could be proud of. I was building a life that didn't need their permission. And that is a very different kind of architecture. Part 5, what I built from their silence. I didn't get closure from my family. So I built my own closure didn't come in a conversation. It came in clarity. And with it, I didn't rebuild my place in their lives. I built a life that never needed to fit theirs. There was a room I kept in my heart for them. It wasn't literal, but I could see it clearly. A space where my parents sat across from me, finally listening. A space where my sister apologized. Not to win, but to understand. I dusted that room often, rearranged the furniture, hoped they'd show up one day, but they never did. And in the days after the wedding, I finally locked that door. The rage didn't vanish. It evolved. Instead of simmering beneath my skin, it moved into motion. I spent the next week diving into everything Edward and I had discussed. Papers, prototypes, notes I hadn't touched in years because they were too ambitious, too radical, too much. Now, they felt just right. It wasn't about proving myself anymore. It was about creating from truth, not pain. Edward didn't treat me like a novelty. He didn't dangle praise or speak in vague admiration. He asked real questions, challenged my assumptions. He saw me as a peer. And more than that, he made space for my vision. You see around corners, he said one evening after a long strategy call. Let's make sure this thing is designed by people who don't just inherit the world, but actually build it. I didn't answer right away, because part of me was still adjusting to the sound of being heard. But the grief still came in waves. Not for my family, for the version of myself who waited, who edited her emails to make them sound less impressive, who smiled small so others wouldn't feel small beside her, who dressed down, dimmed down, quieted down. I lit a candle one night and sat with that girl. I didn't hate her. She had kept me alive, but she didn't get to lead anymore. Edward's offer became more than a position. It became a platform, not just for tech, for truth. We designed an initiative that supported women in innovation, those without legacy names or polished pedigrees. Women who were told they were too driven or too intimidating. Women like me. And the first keynote we planned, I made sure Vanessa was not on the guest list. Not to punish, but to preserve peace. Some stories don't need an audience. Some stories need a boundary. 6 months later, I stood on stage at a conference in Lisbon. Not Zurich. Not New York. Somewhere new. Somewhere I chose. My name was on the banner, not as someone's +1, not as a footnote to a family tree. As the headline. I saw a young woman in the front row taking furious notes. She looked like me at 22, sharp eyes, quiet hands. After the talk, she came up to me and said, "I didn't know we were allowed to be like you." I smiled. We are. Redefining family without the apology. They never said sorry. I stopped needing them to my mother, never said I was wrong. My sister never said I'm sorry. And somehow, I healed anyway. There was a moment, about 2 months after the wedding, when I thought my parents might reach out. A dinner, a text, a letter maybe, something. Instead, my mother forwarded me an article about women over 35 freezing their eggs. No subject line, just the link. As if that was the most urgent thing she could imagine for my future. Not the initiative I was launching. Not the women I was mentoring. Not the companies I was advising on ethical AI architecture. But eggs. I didn't respond. There's a kind of silence that becomes an answer in itself. I used to be afraid of becoming bitter. That if I didn't keep the door open for them, I'd rot in resentment. But the truth is, some boundaries aren't about anger. They're about air. They're about breathing without constantly holding your breath for the next passive comment, the next erasure dressed as concern. I didn't block them. I just stopped performing for them. Something beautiful happened in the absence. Women I had mentored began writing to me, not as fans but as mirrors. One of them, Marissa, sent me a voice memo after her own family cut ties when she came out. "You helped me realize," she said, "that I wasn't broken, just brave." That voice cracked something open in me. It wasn't my biological family that had failed. It was the blueprint I had built around them. Now I was drawing new ones. Blueprints made of connection, not tradition, of choice, not duty. There's still grief. Of course there is. Every time someone asks about my parents and I pause a beat too long. Every time I see siblings laughing over brunch and wonder if it's real or rehearsed. But healing doesn't mean the wound never existed. It means I don't let it define the shape of my days. I used to think heartbreak was about losing people. Now I know. Sometimes it's about choosing not to chase the ones who lost you. I hosted a dinner of my own. Not for reconciliation, for renewal. 10 women, all different backgrounds. Entrepreneurs, researchers, artists, single moms, introverts. No one asked about husbands. No one commented on wrinkles. No one handed out unsolicited advice about freezing anything. We toasted to failure, to risk, to taking up space. And for the first time in my adult life, I sat at a table where I didn't have to shrink. I was full of laughter, of wine, of the kind of safety that doesn't make noise but lets you breathe. I think we overestimate apologies. We think they're the finish line for closure. But sometimes the deepest healing comes from knowing you'll never hear "I'm sorry" and realizing you're okay anyway. I no longer need my family to love me in the right way, because I've learned to love myself in the ways they never could. That's not defiance. That's freedom. Part 7. Legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you build. They gave me silence. I turned it into strength. They left me nothing but silence. No heirlooms. No warm traditions. Just gaps, judgment, and empty chairs. And I turned it all into a legacy that finally felt like mine. No one passed me a watch engraved with initials. No family recipe was handed down. No journal filled with wisdom from my grandmother ever made its way into my hands. What I inherited instead were conversations I never got to have. Phone calls that never came. A template of womanhood that said, be pretty, be chosen, be smaller than your success. I broke that mold like glass, and I bled. But I kept going. For a long time, I thought legacy meant what you left behind. But I've learned it's also what you live into. The women I now mentor don't just come to me for strategy. They come with questions like, is it okay that my mother doesn't understand what I do? Will I still be loved if I say no? Why does ambition make people so uncomfortable? I tell them the truth. Yes, it's okay. Yes, you'll be loved. And no, ambition isn't too loud. People are just too used to women whispering. Marissa, the woman who once sent me a shaky voice memo, is now my partner in the initiative Edward helped fund. She brings grace I never had at her age, and a fire I recognize in my bones. Together, we built a fellowship for women in tech, art, and research, especially the ones told they were too much, too late, or too alone. Our application process doesn't ask for GPAs. It asks for resilience, for stories. Because sometimes the best innovators come not from Ivy League halls, but from bedrooms lit by desk lamps at 2 a.m., from girls who took apart toasters instead of going to prom, from people like me. Sometimes I still think about Vanessa. I wonder if she ever tells people about me now. If she says, my sister runs that foundation. If it comes with pride, or discomfort. We haven't spoken since that wedding. Not because I'm angry, but because I finally believe in earned closeness, not obligatory ties. And truthfully, the silence between us is more honest than the conversations we used to fake. Every morning, I wake up to a home I built. Not just with money, with peace. There are no portraits of a perfect family on my shelves, but there are photographs of the women I've walked with, mentored, and learned from. There are books I never had access to growing up. There's music that fills the space where shame used to echo. I didn't grow up in a house that celebrated me, but I live in one now. I won't have children, and that used to feel like a lack. But now I know I am still an ancestor. Every time I remind a woman that she doesn't have to apologize for her power, every time I tell her that love isn't something she has to earn through shrinking, I'm planting something. And maybe that's what legacy really is. Not blood, but blueprint. Not inheritance, but invitation. Part 8, the final goodbye I never spoke aloud. I never got an apology, but I got something better. I waited for my mother to say she was wrong, for my sister to say she saw me. But healing came not when they finally spoke. It came when I stopped needing them to. There was one more call I thought I'd get. Not from Vanessa, from my mother. I imagined it often. Late at night, when the house was quiet and memory pressed against the walls. In the call, she'd clear her throat and say, Juliet, I didn't understand what I was doing all those years. I thought love meant safety. I didn't realize it could look like shrinking you. I played that script like a bedtime story. The fairy tale version where the mother wakes up and says all the right things. But the phone never rang. And I learned to fall asleep anyway. It's strange. Letting go of anger feels like grief. Because for a long time, anger was the only thing I had in place of love. But one morning, while brushing my teeth, I looked at my reflection and asked aloud, what if she never changes? And the answer didn't break me. It steadied me. Because when I stopped hoping she'd become someone else, I became someone more whole. A few weeks later, I met a young woman at a conference. Her name was Celine. Quiet, brilliant, holding herself like she was waiting for permission to exist. She asked if she could email me. I said yes. What she didn't know is she reminded me of me. When she did write, it wasn't about strategy or advice. She wrote, how do you stop loving people who hurt you? And I wrote back slowly, you don't. You just stop waiting for them to love you the way you need. And you build that love inside yourself instead. You give it a home. I didn't get a dramatic ending with my family. No slamming doors. No epic monologue. Just a slow turning inward. A final setting down of the weight I'd carried so long, I forgot it was optional. One afternoon, I cleaned out an old box in my closet. Inside, birthday cards with blank space where pride should have been. Notes that praised my appearance but never my ideas. A framed photo of my sister and I at 16. Me holding the camera, her holding the spotlight. I placed the photo face down. Not out of spite, out of relief, because I didn't need to look at it anymore to understand the story. In therapy, I once asked my counselor, "How do you know when you've healed?" She said, "When you can tell the story without needing it to hurt anymore." And now, I can tell you the story without flinching, without that old ache in my chest, without needing to be rescued or avenged or pitied. Because healing, it turns out, isn't loud. It's subtle, it's steady. It's the space you reclaim inside your own bones. To anyone listening, if your family never saw you, if your mother only knew how to worry, if your brilliance was treated like rebellion, if you were asked to shrink in order to belong. Let me say this plainly. You don't need to earn your place, you already have it. And it was never theirs to give. You are allowed to be the first in your family to break the pattern, to walk away, to build your own table, and fill it with people who clap when you speak. Not just when you stay quiet, you are allowed to become the person you needed. And when you do, don't look back for permission. Walk forward. That's where the real story begins. Part 9, the life I didn't wait for, I didn't get the family I wanted. So I became the woman I needed. They never came around, and I stopped circling back. What I found when I stopped chasing approval wasn't loneliness, it was freedom. There was a dinner last fall, a fundraiser, hundreds of guests. I was the closing speaker. I stood backstage reading over my notes, preparing to address a room full of decision makers, politicians, CEOs, researchers, artists. And for a brief second, I looked out at the crowd and imagined my parents sitting in the front row, my mother in pearls, my father with his folded hands. I imagined what it would feel like if they finally saw me. But I didn't linger there. Because what filled that space wasn't longing, it was clarity. They weren't here, and I was still whole. For years, my fire came from proving them wrong. Every accolade, every headline, every contract I negotiated without an ounce of inherited privilege. But now I build from something deeper, not resentment, not revenge, from vision, from truth, from enoughness. Because once you stop needing applause, your work becomes sacred. After that speech, a young man approached me with tears in his eyes. He said his father had never acknowledged his art, that he had spent most of his life trying to be practical so he wouldn't be a disappointment. "You made me realize," he said, "I can stop asking to be seen and just start making what's inside me." I hugged him, not as a mentor, not as a public figure, as someone who knew exactly what that sentence cost to say aloud. I still get waves. A smell, a song, a voicemail from years ago. Grief doesn't vanish, it softens. There are still days when I see a mother and daughter laughing at a cafe and feel something tighten in my ribs. But I don't turn away. I let it rise, let it pass. Let it remind me of how far I've come. Joy used to feel like rebellion, like I was being too much for daring to be full while others chose emptiness. Now I let myself laugh loudly, eat what I want, wear black without apology, cry during sunsets. I stopped editing my joy for people who never asked about my sorrow. And in doing that, I reclaimed every part of myself they once tried to mute. If you followed this far, maybe you see yourself in me. Maybe your parents only celebrate weddings and babies. Maybe your success makes them uncomfortable. Maybe your truth was too loud for their small story. Let me offer you this. You are not too much. You were never too much. You were born to break patterns, to interrupt silence, to become the ancestor your future self will thank you for. You don't need a better family to become a better woman. You just need a deeper relationship with your own voice. That's the life I live now. Not loud, not lonely, liberated.